All right, class. So on Friday, we talked about the Treaty of Versailles. We did our simulation where we had characters and we tried to negotiate a treaty that the Allied powers were going to offer up to Germany since Germany asked for peace. So once again, we talked about what the big three, or really the big four, negotiated: Britain, France, Italy, and the United States. We came up with that they decided to blame Germany for the war, made them pay reparations, reduced their military. France and Great Britain split colonies captured from Germany and Turkey. A piece of France that was taken by Germany, Alsace-Lorraine, was returned to France. Poland and several other nations were given independence, and the Big Four decided to form a League of Nations. So we talked about that as the Treaty of Versailles, and the United States played a key role in developing the Treaty of Versailles. Woodrow Wilson really was one of the visionaries that developed this treaty. Wilson came to the peace treaty at Versailles with what he called 14 points. And these were 14 things that he thought were very important for the world moving forward, and 14 things that he wanted to see as part of the peace negotiation process. And as the peace negotiation process went on, more and more of Wilson's ideas were making its way into the Treaty of Versailles. So really, Wilson's 14 points had a huge influence on Versailles. Of course, so did the wants of Great Britain and France and Italy. But really, Wilson's vision played a big role in some parts of the treaty. So Wilson's first 5 points basically focused on preventing future wars, and this was things like open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, the removal of economic barriers such as tariffs that prevented trade between countries, the reduction of armaments, and he wanted to see European powers adjust their colonial claims, meaning he didn't want to see countries fight over boundaries. Unfortunately, that didn't happen in the actual treaty. The next 8 points were designed to promote the independence of nations, and these were nations of people that were formerly part of larger empires, mostly in Eastern Europe, in either the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, or the Ottoman Empire. So Wilson really pushed for the restoration of French territory, the division of Austria-Hungary into several smaller countries that were based along ethnic lines, the redrawing of several boundaries between Turkey and the Balkans. Wilson was a huge proponent of an independent Poland. Poland at one time had been a large, powerful empire in Eastern Europe between Germany and Russia, but over time it had been conquered. And Wilson thought that this was a great time to give those people an independent nation again. And then his 14th point was probably the most radical, or at least in the eyes of many people in the United States, which was create a League of Nations. And this was supposed to be an association of countries who would meet together at the world stage. And Wilson hoped that this would promote open diplomacy and reduce economic barriers and give countries a forum in which they could basically negotiate or discuss world problems before they spilled over into regional or global conflicts. This really is kind of like the predecessor to the United Nations, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and which we currently have today. But it's basically a sort of a world congress, where countries could send representatives and really talk about the things that Wilson wanted to see happen. Remember, Wilson told Americans and told the world that the United States was fighting in World War I to make the world safe for democracy. And the League of Nations was going to be a key piece of that, promoting democracy in Europe and in other places around the world. This cartoon kind of shows both the British and the German perspective of the Treaty of Versailles. From the British perspective, they were going to dictate peace terms to the Germans, and if they wanted a ceasefire, they were going to take it. For the Germans, it's very symbolic that these peace terms were going to be a really tough pill to swallow. That the Treaty of Versailles um, and the terms that negotiated along with it were very harsh on the Germans. Um, the treaty took away quite a few bits of German territory. The reparations were very harsh, and they were um, pretty tough on the German economy. They weren't allowed to have a standing military, so or a very small standing military. So Germany was very weakened by this. And again, a lot of Wilson's 14 points made its way into the treaty. So of course we could see Woodrow Wilson as one of these big four over there helping to force this pill down Germany's throat. The United States, however, had a different point of view on the treaty. Not every member of the United States Senate thought that Wilson's 14 points or the negotiated Treaty of Versailles was good for Europe or for the United States. Now, remember, in the American system, the president gets to conduct foreign policy, the president gets to negotiate treaties, but the Senate has to ratify them. And that's because the Senate is really the representatives of the states, and therefore the states have to approve any sort of negotiation or any sort of agreement with a foreign power or foreign country. So in these two cartoons, we can get the perspective of a lot of Americans and particularly a lot of senators regarding the United States signing the Treaty of Versailles and whether or not it should do so. So in the debate in the Senate about whether or not the U.S. should agree to this treaty, even though Woodrow Wilson was one of the architects, the debate was very fierce. And over here in this cartoon, we can see interrupting the ceremony, and there's a gentleman here holding a card that says the League of Nations, and we have Uncle Sam looking like he may marry this woman named Foreign Entanglements, and it says, "If any man can show just cause, why let them may not lawfully be joined together, let him speak now." And here comes the US Senate jumping in with constitutional rights in his hand. In this other cartoon, we see Uncle Sam's hands tied by the League of Nations, four nations, European nations, England, the Empire of Japan, all kind of tying the United States' hands. The message in these cartoons is very, very clear that one key piece of the Treaty of Versailles, of joining the League of Nations, was going to prevent the United States from making decisions on its own all the time. There was a fear that by joining the League of Nations, that the United States would be drawn into foreign entanglements and into foreign wars more often than the United States wanted to. And because World War I was so destructive and disastrous, the U.S. Senate, many U.S. senators, did not want to see the U.S. sign the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations. Probably the leading isolationist or the leading critic of the Treaty of Versailles, and particularly the League of Nations, was Henry Cabot Lodge, senator from Massachusetts. And in the debate over whether or not to sign the Treaty of Versailles and join the League of Nations, he said to the Senate, "Are we ready to give to other nations the power to say who shall come into the United States and become citizens of the Republic? If we do this, we are prepared to part with the most precious of sovereign rights." Basically, if the United States were to join the League of Nations, it could be subject to decisions made by European countries and Asian countries. And Henry Cabot Lodge was asking Americans and senators if they were prepared to give up some of our power to make decisions for ourselves. He believed that joining a League of Nations would violate the Constitution, where the states and the people are sovereign. And if we join the League of Nations, we'd have other people who are making these decisions that really should be made by the people or the United States government. This point of view is extraordinarily isolationist. It's a departure from what the United States had been doing for the past 40 or 50 years. Remember, the United States had been building an empire in Latin America and in the Pacific, and had become very involved in world affairs with the Spanish-American War, involvements in Latin American civil wars, and of course World War One. But this speech right here shows us that Americans were becoming increasingly suspicious of involvements with other countries and increasingly worried that our involvement in the global stage was going to draw us into long, drawn out wars, very much like World War One. And so we see Americans start to become a bit more isolationist or wanting to isolate the United States from the rest of the world rather than become involved. So the Senate defeated the Treaty of Versailles 49 to 35. We rejected it, did not sign it, and that meant the United States would not agree to the peace terms with Germany the way that other European powers did. The United States did not join the League of Nations, and again, that opposition was led primarily by 39 senators, which called themselves the Irreconcilables. They were opposed to entering the League of Nations. Woodrow Wilson refused to revise the treaty and vote on other parts of it separately, and then the League of Nations on its own. And so, because of that, Wilson said we're either going to take all the treaty or none of the treaty. And then because of that, these 39 senators held strong and convinced 10 others to vote with them against signing the Treaty of Versailles. Later on, Congress would pass a joint resolution officially ending the war with Germany in July of 1921. So for the United States, technically World War One lasted into 1921 because we never signed the Treaty of Versailles. So while World War One ended for most of the rest of the world in 1919, for the U.S. it technically dragged on into 1921 as we were in a state of war with Germany until we signed this resolution. So the United States did not sign the Treaty of Versailles, and European nations did. So the U.S. rejected the treaty, but European nations didn't, and so that means that the map of Europe looked very, very different after World War One. We looked at a map of Europe prior to World War One as we filled out, the Triple Entente and the Triple Alliance, and there were some great empires in Europe prior to World War One. There was the German Empire, the Italian Empire, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Russian Empire. Great Britain and the United Kingdom consisted of all of the islands, the British Isles. But after World War One, thanks to revolutions, civil wars, and the Treaty of Versailles, Europe looked very, very different. Changes made by the Treaty of Versailles included breaking up um, Austria-Hungary into a variety of different countries, including Czechoslovakia, which included the Czechs and the Slovaks in the one country, Austria-Hungary broken up into two different ones. Many of the Balkan states, including Serbia and Croatia, formed together into a country called Yugoslavia, which would later turn out to be a really bad idea. Italy gained some territory from the old Austrian-Hungarian Empire, and their territory was redrawn a little bit. Romania got much larger, and the Ottoman Empire and Turkey's boundaries changed a bit as they changed their name from the Ottomans to Turkey. Um, Poland was created out of the Treaty of Versailles, and it took away land from both Germany and Russia, something that again would be extraordinarily controversial and help contribute to World War II. During the Russian Revolution, several states broke away from Russia. And so here we had the Russian Empire over here going all the way to the Baltic Sea. After World War One, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Finland had all broken away from Russia. And rather than the Russian Empire, it was now the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Again, Russia or the USSR also lost some territory to Poland. So the Russian Empire that came almost into Central Europe prior to 1914 was now much further east than it had been before. Of course, Germany had territory taken away from it. Some areas here, again, that used to be Germany, Poland, and there was a little free city here of Danzig created, which was used to be part of East Prussia. East Prussia would still be part of Germany, and notice Germany is now sort of fragmented, where Poland kind of cuts in between, pardon me, cuts in between Germany and East Prussia. So Germany had territory taken away from it. And over here, Alsace and Lorraine along the Rhine River was also given back to France. You can see this little area that kind of juts into Germany here along the Saarland. This was resource rich and mineral rich, which again would be something that would help lead to World War II. Finally, we look at the United Kingdom. We notice over here again, all the islands in the United Kingdom were under one government, including the island of Ireland. But after World War I, Ireland and Northern Ireland would split up into two different countries, and Ireland would become the Irish Free State, separate from the UK. That would happen largely to the Irish Revolution, or Easter Uprising in 1916, to lead to the Irish Revolution, which happened during World War I. Again, that was actually partially supported by Germany. But anyway, Ireland would become a separate country, and the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would remain with the UK. And of course, as we go on in world history, this would become a source of regional and eventually global conflict in the future as well. So World War I had a profound impact on the shapes of states in Europe. There were a whole bunch of new states that were created for the first time after the war. Empires were weakened significantly as they had territory taken away from them. There were some new countries formed that put together some rival ethnic groups, particularly Yugoslavia, that would eventually create tensions in Europe throughout the 1920s and the 1930s, and that would all come to a head in World War II. So, just kind of summing up, Woodrow Wilson and his 14 points played an important role in creating the Treaty of Versailles. Not every single one of his points was put in the treaty. Like, for example, Wilson didn't want to blame Germany, but the rest of the world did. But there were important things in the treaty, such as the independence of these nations here in Eastern Europe, the creation of Poland, and the creation of a League of Nations. Unfortunately, the United States rejected the treaty because of fears that it would put too much power in the hands of foreign countries. The United States did not sign the Treaty of Versailles and did not join the League of Nations. So the next step now after viewing this video would be to go to the assignment on answering some questions about Europe, the changing map of Europe, and the League of Nations and the end of World War I. See you next class.